decided that Gali will speak.
Gali is here. Gali is here. Gali is here.
So the stage is yours, Gali.
Oh, thank you. שלום, צהריים טובים. נעים להכיר. זאת הזדמנות מצוינת בשבילי להכיר. בהתפעלות, אני חייבת לומר, לברך ביום הולדת 90, זה זכות גדולה והישג גדול, ולהגיע לדעתי לגיל, כשכל כך הרבה חברים וקולגות מקיפים אותך בהערכה, זה אומר שהצלחת לבסס יחסים משמעותיים לאורך זמן. ואין מטלה מורכבת ומספקת מזו לדעתי. לא רק להעמיד דורות של אנשי מקצוע מצוינים, של קולגות מצוינים, אבל גם דורות של חברים שמגיעים בהתלהבות לברך ולהקשיב לך. אז אני נרגשת ביחד איתם, לברך אותך במזל טוב, בהמשך בריאות טובה, ובהמשך עשייה משמעותית של יחסים משמעותיים עם הסובבים אותך ועם העולם. I salute you for your achievement to establish through the years such a meaningful relationship, professional and also personal. And I bless you and all of us with health and happiness, and may we meet again, real, not via Zoom, and celebrate life, friendship, and love. Mazal tov.
Thank you very much, Gali.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so now it's really my turn, and I'm speaking English because we have here our very dear guest, David Rowe, and I wanted everybody to understand. I will also say a few words in Hebrew, but mostly it will be in English. So, to start with, in the name of the whole Coherence Institute, and as chairwoman of this session, I would like first to welcome Sabetai, his family, whoever is joining us here, his students and ex-students, colleagues, friends, and all participants who have joined us today. I don't see all of them, I guess. And first, congratulations, Sabetai, for, doing everything that you have been doing with us and for us along the years. So we are here to celebrate Sabetai's 90th birthday, and we do it in the best way we could think of, namely by opening a real conversation and debate following a series of lectures in a scholarly conference. I do believe we can reach our goal in spite of the social distancing that prevents our sitting together in the same room while enjoying small talk in between lectures and sessions. So this will not happen, unfortunately. And thank you all for coming and joining this meeting. Long ago, when Sabetai was the head of the Coherence Institute, he used to chair most of the sessions of our research seminar. This was the tradition, and is still the tradition. And when the speaker was personally close to him, Sabetai would say, X is a friend, a close friend. On the same wave, I shall say now, dear Sabetai, our beloved friend and sharpest critic. I am sure these words express in a nutshell what many of us feel and think. In his personality, Sabetai embodies this rare combination of being a mathematician, a historian of mathematics, and a thinker humanist of the broadest kind, a real connoisseur of German literature and immersed in philosophy no less than in science and literature. From him, I learned what historization of scientific concepts, including mathematical entities, really means. In the early 80s, the attempt to historicize mathematical concepts was a cause for ferocious controversy in our discipline. But Chaptai has never been one to turn his back on controversies. The other way around, he has thrived in such debates. Though no one could doubt that they were also a burden to bear. In any case, such debates have never deterred Chaptai's creativity as a historian of Greek mathematics. See his books together with Michael Fried on medieval optics, see his book on Vitello, and see also his more general introduction to the history of mathematics. All this, however, did not prevent him from being a sharp critic, though his criticism was always steeped in a supreme sense of humor. And so, when Adi Ophir and I presented our work on Giordano Bruno in the research seminar, Chaptai shortly presented each of us, and I fully remember his words as he said, he said, started away with research on Galileo Galilei, where she did really well. She then deteriorated, however, to writing on Bruno. And this you can imagine, and after this you can imagine how outraged Chaptai was as he read an essay I wrote for the journal's Ranim, which I dare to title, Why Do We Need Deconstruction to Read the Book of Geometry? ולסיום אני אגיד כמה מילים בעברית. ובכן, במסכת אבות נאמר, בין 90 לשוח, ואין הסכמה על המובן המובהק לשוח. אז בפירוש שלי, שבתאי בין 90 לשיח, בין 90 ובין השיח הנבון, המלומד, וגם בעל ההומור העוקצני. אז עד 120 ותמשיך שבתאי איחולים מעומק הלב של כולנו. So, well, it's really bad to say all these things over Zoom, but that's what we can do. Our first speaker is David Rowe, a mathematician and historian who served as book review editor of the prestigious journal Historia Mathematica, and then was nominated as professor of history of mathematics and natural sciences in Mainz. In recent years, he has co-edited a volume on Einstein and politics, his private thoughts and public stands on nationalism, Zionism, war, peace, and the bomb. But for us, David's claim to fame is that he had been a student of Chaptai at the University of Oklahoma many years ago, and his broad fields of interest certainly point to the prints Chaptai left on his work. So David, may you start? David will speak on personal reflections on Sabetai Unguru's broader influence on historiography. David, please.
David, you're mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, Rivka, thank you very much for the kind words, and let's hope that the gods of the internet will bless our Zooming today, which is always a tricky business. Yeah, it's a huge honor for me to speak here on this very splendid occasion. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and also, yeah, just even though it's a Zoom event, I think this is really a wonderful occasion. It brings back many, many memories, and I see a number of familiar faces here. Of course, Yoki, above all. Hilda and I have many fond memories of times with Shabtai and Yoki. And so this invitation brought back many memories for me. And since several others who will be speaking afterward, I'm thinking of Michael and Orna and Reviel are experts on Greek mathematics. I can't claim any such expertise at all, though I will sneak in a few things in this talk because that is my connection with Shabtai, in fact. But because of that, I chose this topic of Sabetai Unguru's broader influence on historiography, which I think is absolutely clear. He will deny it, of course, but I think it's obvious that he came into the controversy surrounding his work and so forth came at exactly the right moment, and it was of profound importance for historiography in general. So I'd like to take this occasion to express my personal appreciation for that broader influence that he's had. And I'm sure many others feel the same way. They don't see his influence as in any way confined to Greek mathematics alone. Although that he made his name and fame, of course, by that's attached to the debates that he provoked by attacking contemporary scholarship in that field. So Shabtai, having achieved considerable notoriety for having done so, you might actually consider staking a certain claim to immortality. I wouldn't personally advise you to follow up on this idea, but in fact, you could choose as your epitaph the one that your most famous critic actually attached to your name. And in that case, the inscription on your gravestone would then read, "Here lies Sabetai Unguru, he who once betrayed Euclid." Well, seriously, folks, Shabtai obviously touched a raw nerve when he forcefully called out those who wrote about geometric algebra and the interpretation of Euclid's Book 2 as a geometrized form of an older algebraic theory. As if that theory were a well-grounded reading rather than a highly speculative enterprise. Now, Leo will be taking up this topic directly, and so I don't need to say a lot about Book 2 here, but it will pop up in a few places. First, though, I'd like to say a few words about how my world line crossed Shabtai's. It takes a little imagination of what Oklahoma was like in the 1970s. But in fact, that's where we met. And the circumstances that drew me into his sphere of influence were really quite different from the typical experiences of a graduate student. I was working on a PhD in mathematics in Norman, Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma in the 1970s. And it just so happened that the history of the science department was located in the same building as the one that housed the mathematicians. So occasionally I would see Shabtai going up and down in the elevator. That was before I even had any idea who he was. But if you can form a picture of what people in Oklahoma might have looked like back then, well, I guess you can easily imagine that Shabtai stood out. As all of you undoubtedly know, it was during this time that he published his lengthy article on the need to rewrite the history of Greek mathematics. This appeared in a 1975 issue of the Archive for History of Exact Sciences, which was then edited by Clifford Truesdell. It immediately provoked a number of rebuttals, and I read all these things after meeting Shabtai, who 4 years later finally got to respond to his critics in the pages of ISIS. Now, Shabtai may not know it, but one of the best mathematicians on the faculty in Oklahoma told me he was very impressed by the response that Shabtai gave in ISIS in 1979. These two journals, of course, were obviously, they reflected very different historiographic perspectives. So the archive, of course, is devoted to internalistic studies of great length sometimes, whereas ISIS publishes the works that are of most interest to members of the History of Science Society. Shabtai actually originally submitted this long paper to ISIS, but they turned it down because it was too long, and we can all be thankful for that. Had it appeared in ISIS, it never would have gotten the response that it got when he published in the archive. So just a few words about the controversy. When how did that come about that I learned these things? Well, I took an undergraduate course from one of Shabtai's colleagues, and he told me about the notorious Professor Unguru. And since one of the lessons that Shabtai imparted to me after that was the importance of close textual readings, I want to read a passage from a work written 40 years ago. And it goes like this. In chapter 1 of this thesis, I've attempted to indicate the manner in which this work is related to certain ideas first promulgated by Sabetai Unguru. It will be obvious to the reader who is familiar with Unguru's work that the connection between his work and my own is very close. This is, of course, hardly accidental. I have sought his counsel at every stage in the composition of this thesis. Moreover, the motivation for everything that appears here stems from his work. Obviously, we have not always seen eye to eye on every issue. Actually, that's incorrect. I said certainly, not obviously. Certainly, we have not always seen eye to eye on every issue, but always our discussions have been constructive and often enlightening. My baptism into the study of Greek mathematics came by way of reading Unguru's controversial article, and he's guided my study of the subject ever since. During the fall 1979 semester, I undertook an intensive study of Euclid's Elements, which he directed. Then, in the spring of 1980, I attended his seminar in ancient mathematics, which Liba will remember very well since she was in it with me together. We've had innumerable discussions throughout the past year, and I am pleased to acknowledge the profound personal and intellectual debt that the present work owes to him. Well, you will have guessed that comes from the thesis that I wrote with Shabtai in the acknowledgement section. I hadn't looked at this for decades, but I pulled it off the shelf a few days ago after getting this invitation, and rereading it gave me quite an odd sensation. There's plenty of youthful passion in that text, written by a young fellow who seemed to share more than a little of Unguru's dragon slayer mentality. At my oral defense, in fact, one of Shabtai's older colleagues berated him for something like corrupting youth. And Norman, being Oklahoma's Athens, I suppose this was an accusation that was meant as a serious rebuke. Well, since I certainly felt that Shabtai had done nothing more than stimulate my curiosity, it didn't dawn on me at the time that this might have been more than a mere misunderstanding. There shouldn't have been any real misunderstanding, though, as I had taken pains to point out that my entire argument was purely analytical and mathematical. Reading some of his commentaries in his classic edition of Euclid's Elements, I noticed that some of his claims appeared forced. Following Tanuri and Soiten, Heath tried to elucidate their earlier interpretations with remarks that seemed to clash with what one found in the text. Had I known anything about Descartes' famous La Géométrie, I could have pointed out that on his reading, Greek mathematicians already had Descartes' segment arithmetic at their disposal. But if that were so, why in the world did they insist on constructing products by means of rectangle formation? Well, questions like that made it pretty obvious to me that Heath was moving on a very slippery slope. My entire methodological approach differed from Unguru's far broader arguments, which ultimately rested on issues reflecting the relationship between language and thought. Sabetai emphasized these differences in our jointly published two-part paper in Libertas Mathematica, then a new journal published by the American-Romanian Academy of Sciences and Arts. Thanks to his Romanian roots, my small contribution to debunking geometric algebra thus found its way into circulation. Its methodology amounted to nothing more than rational deconstruction. And since I'm not even fond of most rational reconstruction, I can't really commend this kind of exercise in counterfactual history. Obviously, it adds nothing positive to our understanding of Greek mathematics. 40 years later, as an old man, I can now see how some passages in my thesis echoed Sabetai's polemical style. He was far more eloquent, of course, whereas my prose was what a reader might well call excited. The source of that excitement, though, was intellectual. Sabetai's accusatory colleague probably had made little effort to understand the mathematical arguments in my thesis. What he noticed was the packaging. This left him with the impression that I was not just defending Unguru's position. Apparently, he thought I was even consciously mimicking my mentor's writing style. Well, if so, it was definitely a bad imitation. But something about Sabetai's writing definitely rubbed off. He wasn't one to pull punches. And I've written my share of critical, even scathingly critical reviews over the course of my career. This is not a good way to make friends in academia. But I know how seriously Sabetai always took his responsibilities as a reviewer. And there is surely no point in writing a serious review if you're not willing to say what you think about a book. Sabetai's intellectual honesty is something we all know and deeply appreciate. Working with him, no doubt, did a lot for my self-esteem. I'd been struggling with my dissertation topic in topology when I first met him. So I took a year off and completed an MA in history of science. And after that, things just started flowing. And by the next summer, I just finished my PhD. Sabetai perhaps remembers my oral defense, which went quite smoothly too. And he knew I was planning to go to New York to work on a second doctorate in the history of science, and he supported that plan. In fact, my wife and I were already thinking about somehow studying in Göttingen, especially since I had in mind to write a dissertation about the career of Felix Klein. Of course, I never imagined back then that I would eventually teach history of mathematics at a German university. During my 10 years in and around New York, I never taught anything but low-level mathematics courses. But we did manage to spend 2 years in Göttingen in the mid-1980s when I was a Humboldt fellow, and we kept going back in the summers. One day, I was working in the archives, and my wife Hilda comes running over in great excitement to say, "Sabetai is here." Well, he had visited us earlier, and so he knew that we lived near the center of the old city. So the surprise visit came about because he happened to have picked up a new car in Denmark, and he was driving it southward. He probably got the idea, hey, I could get off the Autobahn and visit the Rows, which he did. So that was also a very fine visit in that he invited me to give a talk in Tel Aviv the next spring. And that was our first visit to Israel in the spring of 1984. It was also the first time I spoke about a topic that has fascinated me ever since, the careers of Jewish mathematicians in Germany and their subsequent fates after 1933. We pulled up stakes in New York and moved to Mainz in 1992. a big challenge for me since I'd never before taught lecture courses on historical topics, and certainly not in German either. Before that, I knew no one in Mainz and had really no idea how university faculties in Germany could conduct their affairs. It helped a lot that I could just start reading Euclid in German translation to prepare for my first lecture course. I also inherited a doctoral student, Heike Seffern-Weiss, who knew ancient Greek and was interested in classical analysis. She eventually wrote her dissertation on Book 4 of Pappus. Today, she teaches philosophy and classical languages at the University of South Carolina. This is just to say that I was again swimming in these ancient waters, trying to teach my students about things like Euclid's Book 2 and geometric algebra. After some time, I came to realize that those students who were able to translate the geometry into algebra, and that wasn't so many, had a much harder time understanding that these mathematical equivalences might not be the same thing historically. In some ways, this experience was surely similar to a problem Shabtai often encountered. Modern mathematicians are trained to think in terms of essentials. Many of them, as Reuben Hirsch pointed out long ago, are closet Platonists, if not card-carrying members of that creed. That's very much at the heart of Bourbakian structuralism. In fact, Bourbaki's reading of Euclid is truly grotesque because of this. But even a modern text like Klein's Erlangen program from 1872 inevitably gets distorted when subjected to this type of modernist reading. Here's a straightforward example. Near the beginning of his text, Klein describes how a bijective mapping between two manifolds can be used to transfer theorems from one geometry to another. If one knows the group of transformations that act on the first space, this mapping will induce an equivalent group that acts on the second. Klein used this technique often in his early works, for example, to formulate new theorems in line geometry as analogs of known theorems in metric or projective force space. From a modern viewpoint, though, such results are trivial consequences of the fact that the two groups are isomorphic. So the geometries are simply identical. In the eyes of a Bourbakist, Klein's supposed insight was vacuous. Much like the principle of duality in projected geometry, Klein's transfer principle merely provided two different ways of expressing the same theorem. Well, this type of misreading of an historical text is not perhaps what immediately comes to mind when a person thinks of Sabetai Unguru's broader influence on historiography. But plenty of people who work on modern mathematics have come to understand his larger message. To appreciate Sabetai's broader influence from a disciplinary standpoint, though, one should take into account who was who in the field of history of mathematics during the 1970s. It would be hard to exaggerate the power and mystique of the Bourbaki movement at that time. These fellows weren't historians, of course, but their authority stemmed from an impressive command of mathematical knowledge, and even more, a sense of entitlement that they were speaking for the entire international mathematical community. Now, if you're going to assume that kind of authority, it's obviously nice to have history on your side. In Bourbaki's eyes, only mathematicians had the competence to write about important matters in the history of mathematics. Thus, when Sabetai sharply criticized Biel van der Waerden's Science Awakening, even making the author's age an issue, delicate point at this time, well, he crossed a red line when he did that. For Bourbakis, van der Waerden's influential two-volume study Moderne Algebra was practically a sacred text. Martina Schneider has described the broader context of the ensuing debates, taking into account early flare-ups of culture wars in the US. In that connection, Michael Mahoney was even closer to the front lines of battle than Sabetai. Mahoney was coming up for tenure at Princeton when André Weil wrote a savage critique of his study of Fermat in 1973. So already by that time, swords had been drawn. Shabtai's immediate critics, Hans Freudenthal and van der Waerden, were eminent mathematicians, but they truly tried to vilify Unguru. Shabtai answered by quoting what his deceased sister, Simone, had written about the dehumanizing power of raw force. Nasty, but truly on target. In 1978, Weil took his case to the Supreme Court of Mathematics, which convened that year in Helsinki at the International Congress of Mathematicians. His lecture, attended by a massive crowd, was entitled History of Mathematics, Why and How. But his real message was to answer these questions: by and for whom? André Weil was a famous figure in 20th century mathematics, someone whose linguistic abilities were on a par with his mathematical brilliance. In 1958, he became a permanent member of the mathematics faculty at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study. There, he befriended a frequent guest of the Institute's School of Historical Studies, namely Otto Neugebauer. Their intellectual alliance had already formed long before, in fact, as one can see by reading Bourbaki's historical notes, which unconditionally endorsed Neugebauer's speculations about the origins of so-called geometric algebra. In the 1930s, Neugebauer posed the conjecture that the historical roots of Euclid's Book 2 could be traced back to certain algebraic methods which he, Neugebauer, had managed to reconstruct based on his studies of cuneiform tablets dating from the Old Babylonian period. Bourbaki, following Neugebauer's claims, wrote that this could account for otherwise puzzling sources, like the works of Hero or Diophantus. In 1960, when the Bourbaki group was nearing the peak of its influence, they issued a collection of previously published historical notes under the title Éléments d'histoire des mathématiques. And André Weil, though he never said so directly, he never called this Bourbaki's historical manifesto. During his Helsinki lecture, he surely sounded its defense. Well, to appreciate such towering figures as Neugebauer and Weil, one has to see them as part of an entourage of mathematicians who engaged in historical studies during the 1920s. Weil's historical interests deepened when he attended Max Dehn's seminar in Frankfurt. This fascination had much to do with Dehn's magical personality, as Weil later recalled in his autobiography. That seminar, in fact, attracted a number of impressive people. A regular member was Adolf Prague, a Wallace scholar who soon after 1933 emigrated for England and later assisted Tom Whiteside in producing the 8 volumes of the Newton edition. Another linguistically talented attendee was Willie Hardner, who later founded the Frankfurt Institute for History of Science. It was Hardner who communicated Shabtai's paper to Truesdell's journal, part of the complicated story that led to its publication. Hardner was a close friend of Max and Tony Dehn, and in the wake of the arrests that followed the devastation of Jewish property during the Reichspogromnacht of November 9-10, 1938, he provided the Danes short-term asylum at his home in Bad Homburg. That marked the beginning of a long and harrowing journey that eventually brought Max Dehn to Black Mountain College in Western North Carolina after a brief stint at St. John's College in Annapolis. The faculty at Black Mountain, some of whom were German immigrants like the Danes, were mainly composed of counterculture types, artists and writers, philosophers and naturalists. Max Dehn loved it there, and he asked to be buried somewhere in the woods that surrounded the campus. Black Mountain College was remote, but it was no backwater. Some called it Greenwich Village South. This was just one of many such experiments in liberal arts education from a bygone era, and it died a It died out soon after Max Dehn died in 1952. Well, this may sound like mere name dropping, but these were all extraordinarily gifted people who lived through very trying times. Andre Weil was one of the most prominent among them. I should also add that as an historian of modern mathematics, I still continue to read and learn from the historical writings of Bourbaki and especially Jean Dieudonné. Obviously, I don't read these works as some kind of model for doing history, but then their authors never claimed they were doing anything more than interpreting the past on the basis of their own understanding of mathematical knowledge. They were practicing a radical form of presentism. Niccolò Guicciardini will soon publish a volume of essays he edited about the pros and cons of anachronism in the historiography of mathematics. No doubt a number of viewpoints will be discussed in that book, but I would be greatly surprised if any of its contributors would defend the blatant appropriation of the past practiced by the Bourbakists. Their highly filtered, even though erudite writings had one overriding objective. They aimed to inform mathematicians about those historical achievements that really mattered today. All the rest belonged in the dustbins of history. Historians of mathematics today can be truly grateful to Sabetai Unguru for his courage in confronting such indifference to the importation of anachronistic ideas. But we should also be grateful that he expressed so frankly that historical studies, no matter what the field, have only one real motivation and justification, and that is to understand the past. That message, spoken so forcefully, freed history of mathematics from a foreign agenda that happened to please influential mathematicians. As recent historiographic studies have shown, our field has begun to reflect far more deeply about the lessons we can learn from studying the recent history of mathematics. In thinking about this the other day, I told my wife that Sabetai Unguru's contribution reminded me of a compliment Barack Obama once paid to Angela Merkel, though with a slight twist. Sabetai, you were obviously on the right side, you were on the right side of historiography.
Thank you very much, David. And I think that we should delay the question period to after Leo's lecture. If you all agree, then I will introduce Leo now. So our second speaker is Professor Leo Corry. I will call him the second generation leader of the Cohen Institute, who, as all of you are aware, has just finished his mandate as a Dean of the Humanities in our university. His list of publications is long, and you have certainly been acquainted with some of his works on modern algebra, on David Hilbert, his brief history of numbers, and many others. But Leo, too, has been imprinted by his mentor's humanistic inclinations, being the author of the literary world of Borges, as well as of many translations from Spanish to Hebrew. So Leo will speak about book 2 of Euclid's Elements, as we heard. And Leo, the floor is yours, please.
I see he's doing the screen sharing. Okay. They asked me if I wanted to do that.
His daughter and son speak. Call me because I want to.
Okay, thank you, Rivka, for the kind introduction. And I hope that you can see the presentation. Someone to give me an indication that it's there. Okay.
It's there.
Okay, so this is a very moving occasion that we meet here virtually to celebrate Sabetai Unguru 90th birthday. You are probably aware that we have had similar meetings in the past. For example, 10 years ago, we met for another conference to celebrate Sabetai Unguru 80th birthday. And this picture is taken back there with the no less legendary Gabriela Williams close to Sabetai. 2 years prior to that, we have the conference to celebrate the Coherence Institute at 25, which was in many ways to celebrate the founding fathers and the early leaders of the Institute, among which we certainly count Sabetai. Before that, in 2000, we also had a meeting to celebrate Sabetai's 70th birthday. And you can readily notice that the only person that doesn't change much with time is Sabetai. He remains the same all the time. And 10 years earlier, I don't have a picture of Sabetai at that time, but we came also together to celebrate Sabetai's 60th birthday. And that is me, but speaking for Sabetai. You can, if you notice what's on the blackboard, on the whiteboard, you will see that it's about Eudoxus and Dedekind. And I was looking also for Sabetai's picture at the time, and I couldn't find it. But let me just say that Sabetai at that time was younger than I am now. And since then, we have been celebrating his birthday. And not only by meeting, because at that time, I was able to translate that conference, what I talked at the time, well, to translate into Spanish also, and to publish an article in '94 based on that talk. And then, in 2003, we came up with these two nice volumes that, as was written in the introduction, taken together, the two topical issues of science in context were meant as a token of appreciation for the work of Sabetai Unguru and his achievements in the history of mathematics. And then after the meeting 10 years ago, I actually decided that all this business of Greek mathematics and or the Euclid tradition actually is more interesting than I had thought before, and I started to devote some of my own thoughts to it. And I was able to dedicate this article that appeared in the archive to Sabetai. Okay, so I think that at the moment, I just want to warn that when Sabetai reaches the age of 120, B'Sha'ah Tova, and the Coherence Institute decides to devote yet another conference to celebrate him, I cannot promise that I will be around to give a talk, or certainly not with something interesting to say. But we have a long road to go until there, and we will continue this dialogue and expressing, all of us, our appreciation to Sabetai. I think that David was very clear in his talk as to the influence that Sabetai has had on many of us. And I say this independently of the fact that now I am working a little bit on this Euclidean tradition. It's a much more general influence on historians of mathematics, certainly those of us who were students of Sabetai, of which there are many today here, right? So Sabetai, congratulations on your birthday. Yochi, all the best wishes for you and for your family. And well, in the forthcoming minutes, I will say something about book 2, the famous book 2, around which much all of us have learned about the history of mathematics. And in particular about, as I said, the Euclidean tradition. Let me just, for those of you who don't remember this, the interpretation, the so-called geometrical algebra, which was an interpretation of the meaning and the contents of book 2 of the Elements, that was advanced or was subscribed to by the great historians of mathematics of the turn of the 20th century, like Tannery, Zeuthen, Heiberg, and Heath, and according to which the propositions of Book 2 and others, but Book 2 is a good focal point, these propositions can be understood in terms of an algebraic translation, not in the sense that we can make that translation retrospectively, but that this was the idea that the mathematicians, in this case Euclid, working on this, had in mind at the time, only that they didn't have the right words or the right symbols to express it, but the ideas underlying the kind of propositions that we find in Book 2 were all basically algebra in geometric garb, to use the term that was that appeared frequently.
Leo,
And yeah,
so, it seems that there is some noise that I mute everyone except a few, so I don't know if
just a minute.
something that you it's like back like from time to time. Now it's fine, but okay. Well.
Let's hope that now it works. But if there is any problem, just let me know, okay? Anyway, I hope that you heard what I said about geometrical algebra.
We heard you, but there was some distortion.
Okay. And the main point here for us today is that Shabtai criticized this view, as already explained by David, and many of the celebrations for Shabtai have focused on this point and the influence that it has had on many of us. Now, when I prepared my talk 10 years ago, there was a point that I read in the Shabtai and Michael's book on Apollonius that made me think about how to approach this topic. And Shabtai and Michael wrote that the sine qua non condition for such an undertaking, which is reading Euclid algebraically, is the existence of an algebraic discipline matrix ready for geometrical manipulation in dealing with the elements. This also means that the geometrical manipulator of algebra is fully aware of the different disciplinary identities of the two provinces of knowledge he combines to get answers to his questions. And at this specific point, I wasn't completely in agreement with Shabtai and Michael. And I had the impression that the interesting point here is that there is an ongoing interaction between geometry and other parts of mathematics, namely arithmetic and a little bit of algebra, proto-algebra, that would eventually merge into analytic geometry, and well, would allow people, historians later, to give this interpretation. But I thought, I was curious about the way in which geometry, and specifically as it appears in the books, in Book 2, how it interacts with other parts of the Euclidean tradition in order to create new ideas in which the connection between geometry and arithmetic, geometry and proto-algebraic ideas are manifest. And this is the starting point of my own study of these kind of problems, and the kind of article that I mentioned before that appeared in the archives, and later a similar one that appeared in Historia Mathematica, and things that I hope to be doing now after I have finished with my deanship. They start from there. And some people have already heard me speak about this. I'll do it. I will summarize shortly things that I have said and try to show some other things that come up here. So the thing is that if we look at all these stages of mathematics and of the Euclidean tradition, we can see many interesting things happening concerning the interaction between geometry and arithmetic. So we have people in late antiquity like Heron, for whom the proof of the propositions in Book 2 come in a different way. Then we have the Islamicate tradition, including Al-Khwarizmi, Abu Kamil, and Al-Nairizi, the Jewish text, the Hebrew text by Jewish sage like Barchian, Gersonides, Latin medieval, where we have very important people like Jordanus and Campanus and Barlaam, who is less known, but is very important in this evolution of ideas, the early printed versions. These are mainly printers rather than mathematicians. Then the Renaissance figures, which are different, follow different views in the Italian tradition, the French tradition, the Spanish, the German, and others that I can read less, but are there. And then the British tradition, about which I will speak today, including people like Record and Billingsley, Heriot, Oughtred, and later on, Wallis and Barrow. So within this thing, I just want to mention especially, for example, the version of Campanus de Novara, who is one of the most important figures in the Latin medieval tradition of the elements, in which we have other names. But the importance of the Campanus version, as I have said in other opportunities, is double. On the one hand, it's because he added while leaving Book 2 exactly in the geometric form, exactly the same way that Euclid had done it. Also, he adds in proposition 916, which is in one of the arithmetical books, he adds some arithmetic formulations of all the propositions of Book 2. He took this from Jordanus Arithmetica and some influence of Al-Nairizi. And this is one of the important things in Campanus' books. And the second one is that when the first printed edition of the elements appeared, the so-called the Rathold edition, it was based on Campanus, so that people that started to read the elements in printed versions, the first thing they saw was that the geometric propositions of Book 2 can also be rendered in an arithmetic form in a different book, but they appear there. So you have the two versions already appearing in the early printed versions of the elements, even though I must say that not all the subsequent printed versions included the Campanus additions. So there is a very interesting story about how these things evolve. And today, as I said, I want to speak very briefly about the British versions of the propositions, in order to show how people, even before there was something like an established matrix of algebra as we know it, symbolic algebra, let's say, that led to what we know as the analytic geometry, even much before that, there were already some of the ideas of how to look at Book 2 applied and printed and discussed. So I want to focus basically today on these two people, Robert Ricord and Henry Billingsley, who work, as you see, in the 16th century, and to say something about it. And it's very interesting and very clear to see the genealogy of ideas coming from Heron via Al-Nairizi and Barlaam, which here branches to Ramus and Clavius, and here continues to Billingsley, who is the first translator of the elements into English, who also adopted ideas coming from Robert Ricord. And from Billingsley, you have then let's say the heritage going to the other important British mathematicians that came up with versions of the elements or parts of it or ideas from within. So this is what I want to focus on Billingsley, but first I want to speak a little bit about Ricord, who plays an important role here. So one of the branches, as I said, of arithmetizing Book 2 gets a very important focus in the 13th century, beginning of the 14th, with this Greek monk called Barlaam, the Seminara, who wrote an arithmetic treatise based on Book 2. And there he takes, you know, if you remember proposition 2.5, then you have a line which is cut at the middle and cut at a different place, and some things happen over there. You build a certain square, which Barlaam represents as a line, not as a square. And then a plain number built from ADDB, which is a square in the geometric, or a rectangle in the geometric version. And then you have here another square. And this is how Barlaam represents these things. And then he puts them together. So you see that already you have this idea here of putting something that is geometric, like a square, not exactly in the geometric form that it is meant to represent, but it is because we are treating arithmetic quantities, numbers, right? So this idea was adopted by Billingsley in his version of the elements, when he translated the elements into English. But before seeing that in the book of Billingsley, let us take a look at this guy over here, Robert Ricord, who was a very interesting fellow. And he wrote several mathematical treatises, like this one, The Pathway to Knowledge, containing the principles of geometry, etc., and many other things. And this is basically a book that repeats some of the contents of the first 4 books of the elements, but usually without proofs. So you see, for example, here we have the second book. Here we have it. The second book does set forth the theorems, which may be called approved truths, serving for the due knowledge of sure proof of all conclusions and works in geometry. So this is kind of foundations of geometry, and this includes some of Euclid's propositions from the second book. So for example, this proposition over here, which is more or less what we have in proposition 2.5, not exactly the same, but it cuts in the middle and cuts in some other place. And he says, I think I am not the best person to read this in the right manner, but I mean, since I always read in English with the same accent, it will be okay also to read 16th century English with an Hispanic accent. I hope you don't mind that part. So if a right line be parted in 2 equal parts first, and one of those parts again in 2 other parts, as chance happened. So you see, this is the same idea of a theorem, proposition 2.5. The square that is made of the last part of the line so divided and the square of the residue of that whole lines are double the square of that half line and to the square of the middle portion of the same line. Never mind exactly the definition, but I hope that you see that this is the same spirit of proposition 2.5. And if you want to see an algebraic rendering of this so that you get a better idea of what he says, so you cut the line HB in C, which is in the half, and then in another point D, and then if you call this thing over here, if this is X and this is Y, this is certainly X plus Y, which is not what we see, of course, in the text, but just to give you an idea. And then this is more or less what the theorem says. It is close enough to 2.5 in order for us to feel how a person like Ricord approached this theorem. And here it's what is interesting. This is a diagram accompanying this proposition. And he says the following. Look, it's very interesting. So he says, the line to be divided is AB. Without this, sorry. AB. And it is parted into 2 equal parts. And then CB is divided again in 2 parts in D. So the meaning of the theorem is that the square of DB, which is the latter part of the line, and the square of AD, which is the residue of the whole line, these 2 squares, I say, are double to the square of the 1/2 line of the line and to the square of CD, which is the middle portion of these 3 divisions. So you see, this is the way in which he represents the squares, and there is no real direct construction in the way that Euclid does it. But then he goes on and says, which thing that you may more easily perceive, I have drawn 4 squares, whereof the greatest, being marked with E, is the square of AD. The next, which is marked with G, is the square of half the line, that is of AC. And the other 2 little squares, marked with F and G, be both of one bigness, of one size, for reason that I did divide CB into 2 equal parts, so that you make the square F for the squares of DB to the square of A. Now I use different colors to indicate things that appear in the line, in the original lines, and things that do not appear there, right? So there is no proof of this, but look at the way in which he explains. And the way that he explains this geometrical result is by giving values, numerical values, to the various figures. This is the important point that I want to stress here, right? You see it here again with colors. Now I think you don't know, but the square E and the square F are double too much as the square G and the square H, which thinks the easier is to be understand because that the great square had in its size 3/4 of the first line. So how did he get into 3/4 exactly? Well, this is just an example. It's because he said you can cut it wherever you want, okay? So 3/4 of the first line, which multiplied by itself made 9/4. And the square F contained but 1/4, so that both does make 10/4. Then G contained 4/4, being his side contained 2, and H contained but 1/4, which one was 5/4. Never mind, you do the calculation by yourself. The point is that here, Robert Ricord is saying you have a geometrical result. I am not proving it. I'm just giving you to give you an idea of how things work. Take some numbers, put them there, and you will see that the result follows. He's not the first to do it. He's not the first to do it in order to show, but he's the first to do it with these numbers and not to give a proof and just to illustrate the result by means of value, of numerical value. So when you see this, if you were a reader of Ricord, you would see this and say, well, what is this? What is this result about? What do I mean by saying that this is a geometrical result? I am not reading here as a historian Euclid. I am just reading this, and this book was quite popular, right? So when he says that these are the basis for geometry, this is what a reader of him would understand as the foundation, as the basis of all geometrical knowledge. Let's see how this appears in Billingsley. I will not take much more time, but Billingsley is an important. So this is the book, very beautiful book by Billingsley in English, with all the, the diagrams that we are used to see. Polybius, Astronomia, Strato, Marinus, Ptolemy, Aratus. We could spend an hour speaking about the frontispiece of this book, but we will not do that. I just want to mention that, like many other people at the time, he confused Euclid with the philosopher Euclid of Megara. We see it in many, many books. And this book also contains a very well-known and interesting introduction by John Dee, and hence sometimes some people call this the John Dee's Euclid, but we will call it as it should be, the Billingsley Euclid. And this is a very beautiful book, I must say, which is full of pop-up figures in the proofs, like this one over here or this one over here, and all kinds of illustrations of this kind, which are geometric, though not precisely in the way that things appear originally.
ליאו, עברת להיות מיוט בשלב מסוים. לחצת על המיוט בטעות.
כן, לקחתי את זה. אוקיי, אז מקווה שדיברתי על הפופ-אפס והכל.
Pop-ups, after the pop-ups.
After the pop-ups, okay. So the book deals with the qualities and properties of the square and right line figures, which are made of lines and the part. The arithmetician also, out of this book, gather many compendious rules of reckoning and many rules also of algebra with the equations therewith. Okay, he says that you see the rules of algebra and arithmetic from book 2. And just let me go on to make this more precise, because that all the propositions of this second book, for the most part, are true both in lines and in numbers, and may be declared by both. Therefore, I have added to every proposition convenient numbers for the manifestation of the same. So this is book 2 for Billingsley, the first translation of the elements into English. This is how an English reader would understand what is book 2. And more, he says, and to the end of the studious and diligent reader may the more fully perceive and understand the agreement of this art of geometry with the science of arithmetic, and how here and there, sisters, they are together, so that the one cannot without great blemish be without the other. I have here also joined a little book of, well, this is something that he has. So he's saying something that is meant to overcome the gap and the separation that some people have taken very far away in trying to remain true to what they saw as the original spirit of Euclid, also in this time. I will skip this just to show you that in the proof, there is a direct English translation of the original Greek text, which is completely geometric, but also you see there are numbers to give examples, numerical numbers of how book 2 works. And he said the arithmetician, as I said, gather many compendious rule of reckoning and algebra. What is algebra at this point? You know, I would tend to think that when we speak about algebra, we want to give some point where we more or less have the kind of symbolic algebra that we mean when, for example, when Sabetai says, or when Sabetai opposed to those who say that book 2 is algebra in geometric garb. So let's think of Viet, even though it's not exactly yet algebra in that sense. His book on where the algebra, the symbolic algebra appears is the In Artem Analytica Isagog, which is 1591, so 20 years after the Billingsley version. So when he's speaking here of algebra, he's not speaking about well-established discipline, which we can exactly know, and that it appears later on in some version of analytical geometry. It's something that has to do with rules and manipulation and so on, but nothing like a completed disciplinary matrix. So to conclude, what I want to say is that this book was so influential that if we look at people like Wallis or Barrow, you know, two very representative mathematicians of their time and very opposed in their views of how we must treat tradition, right? Like Barrow was intended to be very, very, very close to tradition and to the authority of the ancients and so on. I'm being very schematic about this, but just to give the difference. Whereas Wallis was the one who was trying, who saw in innovation the big value of mathematics, if we can put one against the other. I will not show you all of this, but what I want to say is that both of them came up with their own symbolic versions of the theorem, of the book 2 in general, but also of the book. And here you have a very interesting symbolic manipulation and also arithmetic examples, which is something that it would not surprise us very much in Wallis. But, well, I will skip all of this, even though it's very interesting. But the interesting thing is that also with Barrow, you find that, right? And Barrow uses a lot of symbolic writing for book 2. But he says, he wants to, contrary to Wallis, he wants to say, I did not deviate in any important sense from the original. Symbolism is no more than a way to present Euclid's own demonstrations contracted into a more succinct form. So, and he indeed, let me see if I have here the picture. Yeah, he has, again, some kind of very concise and interesting way to write. So at this point, if I may conclude here, you see that the British tradition that starts, one may say, with Record and Billingsley actually looks, even before there is something very, very clear that we can consider to be the discipline of algebra, symbolic algebra, in the sense of Viet and Descartes and so on, they are already, they are not the first, but here we have it very clear, they are already putting together all of this view of book 2, either if they call it, if they want to see, to stress that it is very geometric or that it is very close to arithmetic, they are making this kind of translations, which in the end, which in the end appears in the discussion as historians between Shabtai and those historians that represented the tradition that put the interpretation at the center of their historiography. So I think that Shabtai not only, at least for me, not only taught us a lot about what was the right way to interpret what happened with the Greeks. At least in my case, this curiosity led me to try to see how the connection that does not exist in Greek mathematics, and that then in the late 19th century and the 20th century is put as a historical interpretation of what was there, what happened with the mathematicians working in this, with these ideas from late antiquity to at least the 17th century. I have already found many interesting things, and I am sure that I will find many more. So Shabtai, only for this, I have a lot to thank you for, but as you know, I have much more than that to thank you for. And let us meet here in your 100th birthday, 110, 120. And again, I don't promise to give a talk, but I will be here if you are. Thank you and congratulations.
רבקה, את במיוט. Right, I muted everyone because there was some noise before. So if everyone wants to talk, please unmute yourself. No, you are still muted.
Okay. Good. So I have to repeat and say thank you for both lectures. They were extremely interesting. Also for many other people who work on 16th, 17th century mathematics. And I think we have some time for questions. So we'll just try to pretend that we are in the same room and letting people talk. Just raise your hand so that I can see. And yeah, David.
This is just maybe for Shabtai and Leo both, but the idea that that book 2, of course, starts with these odd-looking propositions and so forth. But if you read, and Euclid is, of course, very systematic in presenting things. If you read book 1 and 2 together, and you come to the end of the story, then you see it's actually 2.5 and 2.6 are the key propositions that you need in order to prove the theorems in the end. I mean, what is he doing? It's a theory about plane rectilineal figures. It's a geometrical problem about how you can transform such figures into a square, which you would think is, that's so famous, squaring the circle, etc. These are embedded deeply in Greek geometry, And here's a systematic set of propositions, of course, many extra things as well. But I mean, what do you think about the idea that we're somewhat misled because he starts over in book 2 and he has these funny propositions about what happens with the areas in rectangles and so forth when you move them around and so on. But I mean, isn't it sort of misleading in that the idea is clearly this application of areas idea? You want to be able to systematically find the area of rectilinear plane, rectilinear figures, and you need these tools in order to accomplish that. And you can obviously understand everything without thinking, oh, there's some arithmetic or there's some algebra going on here. It's all very self-contained.
Kapta, you want to say something?
Sabetai, can you hear us?
You want to react or?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
No, David asked, and I can answer what I can answer. But the question, if you want to say something.
Well, did he ask me? He asked you.
No, I asked both of you.
I can answer what I think. I remember that what I was trying to say is not so much what was there in Euclid, but how people later on read what was there.
Sure.
I mean, the Shabtai's analysis of what historians have said was in the direction of, look, you are misunderstanding what, as historians, you are misunderstanding what Euclid had in mind over there, and part of which you also mentioned. And what I was looking at, I have been looking at, is how mathematicians started to look at it. Some mathematicians, I didn't mention it today, not many of them in Britain or in the British context, prefer to remain in exactly the way that Euclid had presented things. But I think that while you say I completely agree, what I find interesting is the ideas were so stimulating, you know, that people that were involved with their own ideas and things, and also, you know, in the sense of justifying procedures for solving equations in the Islamic context and so on. They found this so interesting and so useful. Yeah. And there was the question of a continuous as opposed to discrete quantities. What do we do about it? And they found these theorems as very useful to say something about what was going on there. Not as historians, though probably they thought that, some of them at least thought that this is what Euclid had in mind. I don't know. They don't always say that, but they say, look, this, as you know, as Billingsley says here, these are sister disciplines or ideas, and what you say here is the same that you say there, and or Campanus that said, let us say it very explicitly over here. So, yeah, well, you know, in Greek mathematics, Shabtai or Michael may say more, but I was not so much speaking about Greek mathematics, but about how, in various contexts, people read Greek mathematics as mathematicians.
Michael, would you like to join?
I just add something. I think that, yes, you're speaking about a later period. On the other hand, what's interesting about David's question is that you see something about shifts of coherence. In other words, in light of algebra, there's a kind of coherence in book 2. But when you think about book 1, and you think about the development of the idea of equality, of having figures that are equal only if they're congruent in the beginning, and then quickly shifts by 135, where you have figures that are equal but not of the same shape. And then the Pythagorean theorem, in some sense, is two things being equal to 1, two squares being equal to 1, and then you have book 2. You have a different kind of coherence. So, so there's a kind of transformation of coherence from the ancient period to the modern period. I think this sort of really supports the things that you're saying. Very interesting talk, by the way.
So, more questions?
I
Shall
would
we?
like, yeah, I would like to add a small. I think it's just a clarification of or continuing what Leo said himself. So in a sense, you can see in Barrow kind of in somewhat a difference, as you said in the answer to David. He tries to say what is true also about Euclid, not only about the way that he uses Euclid, but he said, no, this is it's the same thing. The symbolism has no meaning. No, it's the kind of transparency which takes much of the meaning for us historians. No?
Of course, I mean, the story is long and it involves many people. And the case of Barrow and Wallis indicate that, you know, at the same time, more or less doing the same thing, and so influenced by the same people, they can be in completely different views about what they are doing and how it relates to the authority of the ancients and to what extent you have to stick to that. So yeah, in the case of Barrow, of course, Barrow, you know, he's at least this is how he's known to all of us, as the person who wanted to remain close to tradition. And yet you see that things happen. And I don't know, you know, if he came today here and took part of this debate, what would he say about Shabtai's historiography? In principle, he has to agree, but then in the details, he may say, well, you know, he's doing this. I don't know, it may be just speculation, but some people were trying to stick to tradition, and yet you see that they make changes.
Okay. Other questions?
I see Liba, I see, no,
Luba?
sorry.
No. If nobody wants,
Orna is raising hand.
Orna, please. Orna?
Yes, thank you, Leo, for this talk. I heard your talk about Hero a few years ago, and this talk now, so there is a huge historical gap between the two talks. And I'm curious to know how can you define the difference between these attempts in pre-algebraic traditions and in the British tradition, in which algebra is already in the scene, in terms of motivation, in terms of techniques, and so on?
Okay, well, Hero is interesting because he is fully into the geometric conception. I mean, he's not doing anything that is not geometric, but his geometrical proof, I think that unintentionally, but so it happens, it can be more easily translated, the proof, not the theorem, the proof can be more easily translated into algebraic terms. So I think that, I don't know, Michael or Shabtai, you may correct me because you know better. People in the late 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th, who come up with the interpretation of the geometrical algebra, usually they speak about the proposition, not about the proof, because I think that you cannot really translate those proofs into some kind of algebraic thought. But Hero's proof is very easy to translate. So it was there somehow already preparing the way for a more operational way of treating geometrical figures, because the key to the proof of 5-2 in Euclid's version is, I don't remember the number of the proposition, but Michael surely does, with the two parallelograms across the diagram, diagonal, right? This is 127, or I don't remember exactly. But this is something that you cannot translate directly or not naturally. You can translate anything, but not naturally. And so that is, I think, the importance of Hero, that in making his own geometrical version, he laid the possibility to translate into algebra. And then, you know, it's a long time. Many things happen in between. Michael, do you agree with that kind of interpretation?
Yeah, I think that's it's pretty good.
Okay.
So I think
I'm always afraid to talk about Euclid in the original because
no, after
the
your talk,
historians are very touchy about what one
after your
says.
talk, Gail, I'm afraid to talk about Euclid.
Okay, others? If nobody wants, I would like to ask and to turn our attention for a moment to those who have opposed what you call the traditionalists. So as you know, I work on the traditionalists, on Clavius, and especially on Christoph Grimberger, who was Clavius's main student, and he was strongly opposed to these kind of, I just read a text of his, where he strongly opposes this. And my question to you is, do you think it's simply a question of authority? Or you have used the word identities of the two, I think I saw, of the two different directions. And my sense is that Grimberger, for reasons of identities, he speaks about market mathematics, and he speaks about it in derogative terms and so forth. So it's not simply the tradition. There's a whole, gamut of reasons why the opposition is strong still in the 16th, 17th century. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I must confess that I haven't seen Greenberg's work on geometry, and obviously I have to. Clavius I know. Clavius I know. And Clavius, I should have read before, but basically he brings in many innovations while speaking about tradition. It's a little bit like Barrow, right?
Okay.
And then the question is, if we may see something similar in Greenberg, like what do they mean when they say that they stick to tradition and to the authority of tradition? Because I think that Barrow, for example, if I bring that example, he's quite honest in saying that his symbolism is not changing the original idea. We can dispute his interpretation, but I think that he really believes that, because we know many other things that he wrote and how he treats tradition in geometry and so on. And he probably believes that he's remaining very true. He was not aware that there would be a discussion by historians in the 20th century about this, right? And so I think that authority is important. Sometimes some of the mathematicians are not original enough, let's say, to come up with new ideas that they cannot, that the temptation is too big not to try new things. I think that one has to go case by case and to understand why this guy worked this way and the other did the other thing. I don't think there is a general rule, even for people who are close to one another, right? Or write similarly to one another. That's, I don't know, one case by case is the only way I know about this thing.
No, I completely agree. I just say that when you examine the identities of these people, it's the nature of tradition to say we repeat what has been before,
Yeah.
but then do other things. And indeed, there is a big historical work in working out these tensions between the two. But,
I agree.
Yeah, but I think Grimberger is a bit different than Clavius. Okay.
David wanted to remark also.
Yes.
Yeah, just, I mean, I agree completely that these things are so complicated and that a case-by-case discussion is the only possible way to do it. I think the most striking example of this sort of thing is, Newton's Principia, a work that had immense impact on the 18th century and so forth. But he's very, very tradition bound. In the first book of the Principia, he's proving things like the way the Greeks would have solved the Pappus problem, in order to refute Descartes along the way. Descartes just simply wrong. So have this sort of war going on internally. That's just one example, I think. But I mean, this thing about tradition and moderns and ancients and all of that is exceedingly complex.
Yeah. So
yeah, I want to connect this discussion to David's to your talk, and this is whether we can have any kind of connections between this seems like a cultural conflict in the 16th and 17th centuries to those in the 20th century, and if you can make some elaborate on this kind of the conflict that you see in the 20th of the culture. Which kind of culture did the algebraic the new algebraic tradition of explaining geometry was so important for them? What did they find?
Yeah, I guess these leaps over centuries I find difficult, but it does seem to me that Leo's, of course, worked a lot on the history of algebra. My interest is more than the history of geometry, but I completely agree with him that these two things are intertwined. There is a very rich intertwining that goes on, and by the time of Bourbaki, you see this very strong tendency, reductionist tendency, essentially, that they are so convinced that everything is essentially can be broken down into fundamental things in which algebra and topology are maybe the two dominant fields. But that there's an ideology behind that that's very, very strong, and they certainly saw themselves as the moderns of their day. And so you can probably look at these tensions between fields of or conceptual parts of mathematics and its history and follow them through into many. I mean, Leo's talk has just touched on that, but that's something you can probably find in nearly every era. And I mean, you can always find then the people who are fighting something like this. I mean, I just was reading Paul Alexandrov's little lectures on topology, which he is actually a spin-off that he published because Hilbert wanted to have it as an addendum to his famous book Anschauliche Geometrie. And Alexandrov, who always came and lectured on topology in Göttingen, was supposed to write this, and well, instead he wrote an independent book that came out at the same time with a preface by Hilbert and so forth. But it's this theme of something in mathematics that you cannot reduce essentially to pure manipulation and formalism and so forth. So he's, of course, an advocate in a certain sense that these things belong together, and he was exceedingly excited because he found a way to connect them, how to connect combinatorial topology with set theoretic topology, and then it gets into technicalities, of course. But he was so excited by this. This was part of a vision to reunite these things. So I don't know if this answers at all what you were thinking about, but I do think that you can see in different eras these tensions playing out in different ways. I don't know if they're the same sort of tension or not. That's probably a bit of a leap, but
yeah. But I would like. I'd like to push a little bit more to one of the questions I had, and this is partially from my ignorance, is that you said that there's the mathematicians, this mathematical establishment view was very much connected to a cultural war, and so that was kind of a modernist attack in general, or which kind of could you tell us more about this context of this culture?
Well, I mean, this has to be seen surely case by case, and Andre Weil, in his very strong views about I mean, the Mahoney case was one such case. I mean, the mathematicians at the Institute were very conservative in regard to sociology and other fields, and and they tried to control appointments in other fields outside of their own fields. And so you can see this as part of, or a small part, I suppose, but it echoes certain tensions that have taken place in academia ever since then, and so forth, about academic appointments, about legitimacy in various fields. And Andre Wey happened to be, you know, someone steeped in classical knowledge and so forth, who had huge respect from many people, and he tried to use that politically at the Institute. So that's a somewhat specific situation, but it echoes what took place later. I mean, I think Norbert Wise was up for an appointment there too, and that never materialized for similar reasons, that there were these conflicts between, yeah, these different groups.
Well, I think we are very close to the end of this session. So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you all for being with us, for speaking, for creating this kind of conversation in spite of Zoom. And I think it has been extremely interesting. Thank you all.
Yeah.
And we,
Just before we complete, I remind you that we reconvene at half an hour after 3 o'clock, 15:30, Israeli time, of course, and that we plan to have a toast after at the end of this day. It will be a little bit difficult to do it together, but I invite you to arrange yourself some wine or whatever kind of liquor you would like, and to have it for the later meeting after about 8, I guess. We'll have a toast. Everyone with his own, so we'll have time with the 2 breaks to get you to arrange yourself one. So thank you, Rivka, and everyone, for meet at 3:30.
thanks. Bye-bye.